Hello and welcome to this talk. I am Victoria Iglikowski-Broad, Record Specialist in Diverse Histories at the National Archives. One of my particular research areas is the history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer people in our records. Now, the National Archives might not be the first place you would think of when you think of LGBTQ history, but in this talk, Hidden Love, I will explore some of the potential of what can be found in this area of our records. Our state records ultimately give a valuable insight into how government interacted with and viewed LGBTQ communities in the past. The state has had a complex and largely negative relationship with sexuality and gender identity over the majority of our collections. Paradoxically, this has left us with many potential sources for the experiences of LGBTQ people. The National Archives records focus on this history, but with surprising stories of defiance, acceptance, and day-to-day normality littered throughout the collections. This talk will take a journey through just some of these stories, through 6 principal case studies. But firstly, for some context, delivered via one of my favourite quotes from our records. "I have only been queer since I came to London. Before then, I knew nothing about it." So this is a very open declaration about sexuality, and it actually comes from a letter that was written between 2 men. The quote from this letter continues, "I am married and have a little girl, 2 years of age, and I still like girls occasionally. There are very few boys with whom I want to have an affair with." Now, there are 2 principal reasons to use this quote to set the scene of this talk. One is the language, and secondly, it's to look at what we hold and why we hold what we hold. So firstly, for language. Descriptive terms relating to sexuality and gender identity have changed over time. For example, the term homosexuality was not used with its contemporary meaning until the end of the 19th century. And many terms used in historical records are considered offensive today. So in this talk, I'm generally going to refer to the language of the time or the legal criminal offence at the time. And this is for several reasons. Our current terms generally did not exist in the past, so it seems wrong to impose our current terminology onto people who wouldn't have had the choice to choose it in their own lifetime. The historical terms are also important to researching these histories. Generally, to use modern terms will not help you find this information on our catalogue. Most importantly, in the vast majority of cases, we do not know how someone would identify in their own language and terms. So the use of the word queer and the description of bisexuality in the quote that I mentioned is a very rare example of self-definition in our records, particularly because they come from the government perspective. So rarely we have people describing themselves and their sexuality in their own choice of words. In this talk, I will use LGBTQ as an umbrella term, especially when I'm talking across time periods and about sexuality and gender identity more generally. But where possible, I will use the specific language of the time. So now to address, why would LGBTQ history end up in the National Archives records? And would you expect such a personal letter discussing sexuality from the 1930s that was written between 2 men to be in a National Archives collections? Ultimately, there are many surprising items in our collections relating to LGBTQ history, and we'll be exploring just some of them today. The quote and the letter that it came from that I referenced were found actually on a raid of the Caravan Club, a 1930s queer venue that we hold key records about. So this is one of the kinds of surprising items that we have that leads us to have rare letters like this. We also have black and white interior images of the club. So it's because of the policing that we have these kinds of records. We hold 1,000 years of history and about 11 million records at the archives. And within that, there are many moments that touch on LGBTQ lives. So this is often through policing and censorship or criminalisation, but even those items are very revealing. But also more recently, we have items that highlight progressive legislation, civil service positive action, and key campaigning organisations writing into government, often to press for change. So what I want to illustrate in this talk is that despite being a national archive and holding state and government records, we hold many surprising personal and community histories within the archives. The National Archives has incredible rich records about LGBTQ lives in the past, such as this powerful, rare letter between two men talking about sexuality openly. Okay, so for a final bit of context. While it was never illegal to be gay, many of the associated practices were criminalised, particularly sexual activity. In the eyes of the law, meeting other men could be deemed as soliciting, and running a club could be seen as running a brothel or a disorderly house. In just going about their daily lives, men could be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. But what about the rest of the LGBTQ spectrum? So I'm sure many of you know that it was never illegal for a woman to have sexual relationships with another woman, although in 1921 it was discussed in the House of Lords. So the House of Lords actually rejected a proposed new offence of acts of gross indecency between women, which had been proposed under the Criminal Law Amendment Bill. The backlash to the passing of this legislation was the fear that criminalising same-sex relationships between women would lead to greater visibility of lesbians, and therefore an increase in their number. Equally, it has never been illegal to be transgender or to alter your gender expression, although the law at various points has made it very difficult. Ironically, the criminalisation of homosexuality between men has actually increased visibility and arguably a sense of collective identity. So we have significantly more records relating to men's relationship with other men in the archives. However, there are still many examples of women loving women and people we now might consider to be transgender within the archives. And the case studies today will really explore the range of what we have. So we'll now explore our first case study. So we're going to start in 1728, when Chevalier de Eon was born. Chevalier de Eon, also known as de Beaumont, represents one of the earliest known examples of gender nonconformity in our collections. D'Eon was a French diplomat, spy and soldier who fought in the 7 Years' War in the 18th century. Due to their diplomatic interactions with government, there are multiple items in our collection in relation to D'Eon. After their role in the 7 Year War, D'Eon published scandalous secret correspondence that revealed French ministerial corruption. To silence them, Louis XVI offered D'Eon an official pension, but on the very unusual condition that they should henceforth dress as a woman. Before this time, there were already rumours about D'Eon being a woman, and this essentially played up to them. In 1777, our French state papers note that D'Eon is to be introduced to the King and Queen in women's clothing. D'Eon lived in London from 1762 to 1777, seemingly as a man, and from 1786 to 1810 as a woman. In 1794, we have their calling card, where D'Eon signed their name Mademoiselle D'Eon, while living at 38 Brewer Street in London, Soho. The gender D'Eon identified with has therefore long been debated. Were they forced to live as a woman, or was it choice? In the later years of their life, D'Eon caused a great spectacle as a very successful fencer dressed in women's clothing. What is interesting is that we have these records not because of their gender identity, or indeed the policing of it, but because D'Eon was working as a diplomat, so because of their government role. The records we hold are therefore in the Foreign Office and state paper records. So this is a really interesting example of early archive records around gender nonconformity. So next we go to 18th century Halifax. Anne Lister was a prominent landowner and diarist who has been termed the first modern lesbian. She dressed in masculine clothes and was also controversial because she proactively ran her own estate. She's become known for her prominent relationships with numerous local women in Halifax. Lister left an estimated 5 million words, documenting her life over many decades, including recording her numerous sexual encounters with the fairer sex. Significant sections of her diaries are in fact in code. You may already know her from the popular TV series Gentleman Jack. In her later life, Lister's lover was Anne Walker. Their relationship moved fast, and just months after meeting, Lister had persuaded Anne to join her living at her home at Shibden Hall. Lister and Walker also did something really unique to show their commitment. On Easter Sunday, 1834, in Holy Trinity Church, Godramgate, they took communion together, an act they both deemed as constituting marriage. 200 years on, the church now bears a plaque acknowledging this as the location of the first lesbian wedding. Lister tragically died while the pair were travelling together in Georgia. Anne took the perilous journey back across the continent, a feat which in the 1800s took 7 months, with Lister's embalmed body in tow. So it would have been a very emotional journey, I'm sure. The pair both have wills held at the National Archives. In an era far before same-sex marriage was made legal, the couple's options to show each other their mutual dedication and love were limited. But they were able to acknowledge each other in their wills, which was essentially a symbol of mutual love, but also legal protection for each other. Lister bequeathed her substantial estate to her friend, Anne Walker, but in an unusual twist stipulated that if Walker should ever marry, she would be disinherited, as if the said Anne Walker should have then departed this life. There were many speculated reasons for this. Maybe it was a controlling act, or a sign of insecurity in their relationship from Anne Lister. Or maybe, in an era where married women could not maintain ownership of their estate, Lister may have hoped to protect Walker and her property. Tragically, Walker was not to stay at Shibden Hall for long. 2 years after Lister's death, she was declared of unsound mind and moved to an asylum in York. There is unfortunately very little written about Anne Walker after this period, and particularly after the end of Lister's diaries, although we do hold a document that certifies Anne Walker to be of unsound mind. The courts of chancery often became involved in cases of determining lunacy when there was a certain amount of money or property involved. So often the lives of lesbian and bisexual women are difficult to trace through archival records, particularly before the 20th century. The National Archives holds a substantial collection of wills, and here there are occasional traces of women's relationships with other women. So we also hold the original will of Lady Eleanor Butler, one of the ladies of Llangollen. The ladies of Llangollen, Lady Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, were 2 upper-class Irish women whose relationship attracted scandalous attention during the late 18th and early 19th century. Now we hold both their wills, on which each are listed as spinsters. Butler bequeathed everything to her beloved friend, Sarah Ponsonby. So wills are legal documents that may appear formulaic and often emotionless, but they can be revealing of intimate feelings and desires. What tells us more about love than whom someone leaves their most prized possessions and their wealth? Love that could not be expressed in other ways can often be seen in wills. And I think these cases show that we need to be open-minded in the ways that we try and trace lesbian relationships through archive material. Now on to our most famous LGBTQ record. So at the centre of this is a calling card. This tiny item was in many ways the downfall of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a brilliant conversationalist and writer at the height of his fame. But on the 18th of February 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry left his calling card at the Albemarle Club, believed to be endorsed with the words, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." The exact words are difficult to read and are debated. Indeed, the hall porter at the time initially read the words "Ponce and sodomite," but Queensberry himself claimed that he'd written "posing as." And there's debate about this within the archive records itself as well. The author of the card was John Sholto Douglas, the Marquis of Queensberry. Wilde had been having a relationship with Lord Alfred Boise Douglas, the son of the Marquis. Queensberry was furious about this and wanted his son to stop seeing Wilde. The card was actually part of an ongoing campaign. For example, a few days earlier, he tried to disrupt the opening of Wilde's new play, The Importance of Being Earnest. On the back of this accusation, Wilde made the fateful decision to privately prosecute against Queensberry for libel, since the note amounted to a public accusation that Wilde had committed what at the time was a crime of sodomy. Essentially, at the centre of the case was the discussion of whether the accusation was true or not. By taking on this libel action, Wilde was essentially incriminating himself. With Wilde's eloquent defence, plus evidence from a series of young male witnesses for the prosecution, the trials caused a huge stir at the time. Wilde ultimately lost the libel case in March. After Wilde left the court, a warrant for his arrest was applied for on the charges of sodomy and gross indecency. He was advised by friends to try and go abroad. On the 25th of May, 1895, Wilde was convicted at the Central Criminal Court of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years hard labour, which was essentially the maximum sentence, so he was really being made an example of. In our collections at the National Archive, we have an important set of records relating to the trials and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde, particularly through the Home Office records, the Central Criminal Court records, and those of the Prison Commission. While in prison in 1897, Wilde wrote De Profundis, his letter to Lord Alfred Douglas. He asked the governor for it to be sent to Douglas, but the request was refused. However, the prison governor did keep the manuscript and give it back to Wilde on his release. Wilde sent several unsuccessful petitions. In the third, he asked for his release date to be brought forward by just 4 days to the 15th of May to avoid unwanted attention. Ultimately, he was released just a few hours early, at 6:15 on the 19th of May, 1897. And after a brief morning reunion with friends, he caught the night boat to France. He was never to see England again. He spent the rest of his life in Paris, living under a false name, and died in 1900. For a celebrity like Wilde, the verdict meant the ruin of his career and the end of his writing. The Wilde trials influenced public attitudes for many years, and indeed decades, so the influence was felt on many individuals who were prosecuted, not just Wilde himself. Now for a different kind of libel trial. As we've discussed, it was never illegal for women to have relationships with other women. So how did the dancer Maud Allen end up as part of her own sensational libel trial? Allen was originally born in Canada. In her early 20s, she travelled to Europe to escape her dark family history. Her brother had been the culprit behind a shocking double murder in San Francisco. By 1906, she was attracting audiences on the stage in Vienna with her version of Salome, based on Oscar Wilde's controversial play. Salome was a biblical figure who was said to have danced before Herod with the head of John the Baptist on a silver plate. Allen quickly became renowned for her seductive interpretation of the famous dance of the Seven Veils. Now, this made Allen controversial for several reasons. She was playing a sexually confident woman on stage. She was dancing as Salome in the context of the Wilde trials, which still lingered very much in public memory. And there were also strict rules at this time about religious depictions on stage. Allen's performances toured Europe and beyond. By 1918, she reprised this role for a private, unlicensed performance in London. By having a private performance, this was a way of escaping the censorship of the Lord Chamberlain, who'd banned Oscar Wilde's work on stage in the aftermath of his trial. An advertisement for the performance was printed in the Times, which prompted an initial backlash, including, unfortunately for Maud, this backlash included from Noel Pemberton Billing, a notoriously right-wing British writer and Member of Parliament who had established the vigilante paper. It was in the pages of this newspaper that the alleged libelous content was published. The paragraph was printed under the sensational headline, "The Cult of the Clitoris." He was accusing Allen of being a lesbian, part of a cult of women who loved other women. Pemberton Billing used this paper to critique Allen's upcoming performance in Salome. Even more shockingly, Pemberton Billing accused Allen of having an affair with Margaret Asquith, the former Prime Minister's wife. These accusations threatened to have a serious effect on Allen's career. She took Pemberton Billing to court. The trial ran over 6 days. At the National Archives, we hold the associated court records, Home Office files, and correspondence around unlicensed plays in this era. Now, the Times published the following quote in June 1918. They said, "It's safe to say that no lawsuit of modern times has attracted such universal and painful interest." Pemberton Billing defended himself. He claimed that he did not know what the phrase "the cult of the clitoris" meant, despite publishing it in his paper, but the fact that Allen did proved her guilt. Allen, meanwhile, admitted that she knew little about Salome, but, somewhat unwisely, told the court that she regarded Wilde as a great artist. Rather than focusing on the libel accusation, the judge seemed more concerned that the uncensored play had got on the stage at all. Despite being the plaintiff, Allen herself was seemingly on trial. Ultimately, the jury found Pemberton Billing not guilty, at which there was said to be a great outburst of cheering in the gallery. In his closing statement, the judge spent a great deal of time detailing how the play was clearly not appropriate for either public or private performances. Salome, Wilde, and Allen were all publicly scrutinised, while Pemberton Billing seemingly had been vindicated. Despite Allen's strenuous denial of Pemberton Billing's accusations, it's interesting to note that Margaret Asquith paid for her apartment overlooking Regent's Park until Herbert Asquith's death in the late 1920s. Furthermore, it was in this apartment that Allen lived with Verna Aldrich, her secretary and lover. Now, this case says a lot about the potential reputational damage and public scrutiny faced by women having relationships with other women, particularly if they were in the public eye. At the heart of this case was the anxiety about lesbian relationships and the profile this trial might give to such relationships between women. The case we discussed in the House of Lords was in 1921, so only a few years later. So trials like this would have really affected those kind of discussions. Now we have a much less well-known case about Lady Austen. In the early 20th century, there was a thriving queer community who were able and willing to socialise despite the significant risks. Men in particular were able to create both public and private spaces to meet other men, socialise and have relationships. Queer social spaces could be found in pubs, restaurants, dance halls, clubs, houses, furnished rooms and even Turkish baths. Despite this, such clubs and spaces were susceptible to police raids. But they can still tell us a huge amount about the queer community at this time, particularly through the records. In 1932, the Park House private ballroom at 27 Holland Park Avenue was frequently rented out for drag dances by the ostentatious Lady Austen for gatherings of Lady Austen's camp boys. The event flyer summed up the drag dance with the compelling phrase, "Live, love and laugh." Spaces such as Park House were only occasionally rented out to members of this underground community. These ballroom gatherings in particular were known as drag dances, where fancy dress costumes and clothing that questioned traditional gender expression was very much encouraged. Lady Austen would greet people at the door of the ballroom with a kiss on the hand. Police files describe Lady Austen as male, but wearing exaggerated makeup and an evening dress. Welcoming in undercover police, Austen remarked, "Don't go and get too fruity yet." Police observations show the ballroom contained around 60 people, and they describe one half of them were attired in evening dresses, and the other half being dressed in lounge suits. All were male. The setup was explained to the undercover officers. Those wearing dresses were termed queenies, and those in lounge suits were called kings. Lady Austen explained, "We take it in turns." The officers each adopted a role and, in keeping with their disguise, pretended to be a couple. At 11:25 p.m, Chief Inspector Smith and other officers entered the ballroom. He notes, "I waited till the officers had got around the room. Then I announced we were police officers. I had the band stopped. I then shouted, 'I want Lady Austen.'" As the premises were raided, Lady Austen defended the dance, and when the police warrant was read out said, "Surely only members of our cult are here. What harm are we doing? You don't understand our love." Police inquired what Austen meant by members of our cult. Why, Lady Austen's camp boys, of course. Austen explained the venue was run for love, not profit. How difficult is it? You don't understand. We don't like women, a drag dance is a dance without women, and give and take is between ourselves. The police recorded the names of all men dressed as women, and took all those arrested to the police station. In the ballroom and cloakroom, police found powder puffs, lipstick, and even ladies' knickers, many of which were taken as evidence at the time. But these items rarely survive in our collections. At the trial, Lady Austen was one of the foremost individuals to be found guilty, with the principal charges of conspiracy to corrupt public morals and keeping a disorderly house. In the course of such raids on queer spaces, police collected witness statements, reports, and photographs. Objects were also gathered as evidence from the scene, some of which survive in our records. Uniquely, this includes a red lounge suit worn by the kings, and this is still in existence at the National Archives collections. This wasn't worn by Lady Austen, but by another defendant, and it's a really unique example of queer material culture from this time. Now, as you've seen, there's amazing verbatim text that can be found in our records, even though they're from a policing context. During the raid, Austen commented, "Oh dear, this trouble would be obliterated if they made our love legal. It would take a further 30 years for homosexual acts in private to be decriminalised in England and Wales." In 1957, the Wolfenden Report had been published, recommending the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality. The Home Office wanted to review the laws relating to sex work, as since the war, the number of sex workers recorded in London had been on the rise. This was also a useful moment to explore the law and homosexual acts, as there had been several high-profile cases. However, essentially this was a secondary motivation. The more repressive legislation towards sex workers was implemented within 18 months of the report's publication, but it took a further 10 years for the recommendations for homosexual law reform to be debated successfully and voted into law. Now, that was 10 years in which men were still being prosecuted for consenting sexual acts. The bill received royal assent on the 27th of July 1967, after an intense late-night debate in the House of Commons. Ultimately, the reform under the 1967 Sexual Offences Act was very limited. It set a higher age of consent for homosexual acts than for heterosexual ones. It only applied to England and Wales, did not apply to Scotland, Northern Ireland, or the Channel Islands, didn't apply to the armed forces or merchant navy, and it had a significant in private court clause that was different from heterosexual couples. Indeed, after the act, arrests actually went up, supposedly because there was greater understanding and awareness of the law. But to someone like Cyril or Morris, Oscar Wilde, or Our Lady Austen, it would have made a huge difference in their lifetimes. So this talk has touched on just some of the records we have relating to LGBTQ history, and I hope you've learnt something new from what we've spoken about. Hopefully, it's enough to entice you back into our collections. I encourage you to explore more of our records because we really have just looked at the tip of the iceberg through 6 principal stories. While there has clearly been progressive legislation over recent decades, there is still a long way to go to get full LGBTQ equality. But for the people like Cyril, who described himself as queer at the beginning of this talk, life would now be very different. Thank you very much for listening.